Forget the marble statues. Forget the triumphant arches and the glorious legions. Close your eyes and listen, not to the myths of Rome, but to the rhythm that truly powered its empire, the clatter of chains, the thud of the whip, and the silent, grinding labor of millions. Ancient Rome was not just a civilization, it was a colossal machine of human bondage, a society built stone by stone, law by law, on a foundation of unimaginable suffering. Tonight, we are going to tear down the veil of Roman glory and step into the chilling reality of its greatest paradox. This is the story of the enslaved, the forgotten architects of the Roman world, and as we unearth their lives, we will discover the true cost of an empire. We speak of ancient Rome, an empire of marble monuments, intricate laws, and unparalleled military might. But we must understand that this grandeur was built upon a chilling and inescapable reality. Rome was a slave society. Not just a society that had slaves, but a society whose economy, culture, social structure, and very identity were inextricably bound to the institution of human bondage. At its peak, it's estimated that as many as 1 in 3 people in Italy and 1 in 5 across the empire were enslaved, tens of millions of individuals whose humanity was legally denied, their bodies and labor the property of another. Tonight, we are going to journey past the triumphal arches and into the shadows to ask a question both simple and profound. What was it truly like to live as a slave in ancient Rome? This isn't a story of emperors and generals, it's a story of survival, of suffering, of the flickering embers of hope in the deepest darkness, and the vast spectrum of experiences that constituted life for an instrument with a human voice. And as we explore this, we will also uncover the surprising ways slaves resisted, the complex paths to freedom, and the chilling mindset that allowed this institution to flourish for 1,000 years. So, find a quiet space, and let us begin this somber but necessary exploration. If you find value in understanding the complete story of our past, the difficult parts included, consider liking this video and subscribing for more historical deep dives. And I'd be interested to hear in the comments what single image comes to your mind when you think of ancient Rome. It's a fascinating way to see the different facets of its legacy. Now let us step back in time, not into a palace, but into the chains that bound an empire together. The path to servitude. The journey into slavery was rarely a single, simple path. It was a multitude of terrifying roads that all led to the same destination, the complete erasure of one's former life and the loss of all personal freedom. The primary and most voracious source of slaves for Rome was warfare. As the legions marched across Gaul, Greece, Carthage, Britain, and the Near East, they did not just conquer territory, they harvested human beings. After a successful battle or siege, tens of thousands of captives, soldiers and civilians, men, women, and children, could be rounded up. These were people who, just the day before, had been free citizens, farmers, merchants, parents. Now, they were prey, the spoils of war. Chained together in long, shuffling columns, they were marched across provinces, often for weeks or months, to the great slave markets of the empire. Many perished on this brutal journey from exhaustion, disease, or despair. For these captives, the psychological shock was unimaginable. They had lost their homes, their families, their gods, their language, and their very names in the space of a single horrific event. But war was not the only gateway to servitude. For a vast number of enslaved people in the Roman world, their condition was determined at birth. They were known as verni, individuals born to an enslaved mother. According to the Roman legal principle of partus sequitur ventrem, the child followed the condition of the mother. A child born in the master's household was the master's property from their first breath. There was a common and deeply cynical Roman belief that verni were more loyal and trustworthy than captives, as they knew no other life and had no memory of freedom to long for. They were often raised within the household, sometimes alongside the master's own children, creating complex and often fraught relationships of intimacy and absolute power. They might be treated with a degree of affection, but it was the affection one might have for a prized animal, an affection that could vanish in an instant, replaced by brutal punishment or the cold calculation of a sale. Then there were the victims of piracy and brigandage. The Mediterranean, especially before Pompey the Great's campaigns in the late Republic, was plagued by pirates who dealt not just in stolen goods, but in stolen people. A traveler on a ship, or resident of a coastal village, could be snatched in a violent raid and sold to a slave trader at the next port. These kidnappers, known as Mongones, were despised figures, yet they were an essential part of the machinery that supplied the empire's insatiable demand for human labor. Children were particularly vulnerable. Unwanted infants, especially girls, were sometimes abandoned by their parents in a practice known as exposure. Left in a public place, these infants would either perish or be collected by speculators who would raise them as slaves, a cheap and heartless way to acquire new property. And in the earlier periods of the Republic, a Roman citizen could even fall into debt bondage, or nexum, effectively becoming the property of his creditor until the debt was worked off. Though this practice was eventually curtailed for citizens, its principles lived on in the treatment of non-Romans. Each of these paths represented a unique trauma, a violent severing from a life of freedom and the beginning of a descent into a world where one's existence was defined entirely by the will of another. The public ritual of dehumanization. If the path to slavery was traumatic, the arrival at the slave market was the public ritual of dehumanization. Great markets, such as the one on the island of Delos or the Forum in Rome itself, were stages for this grim theater. Here, the newly captured or bred human beings were prepared for sale. They were washed, oiled, and fed just enough to make them appear healthy and strong. They stood on raised platforms, often naked, so that potential buyers could inspect every inch of their bodies for physical defects, scars that might indicate a rebellious nature, or signs of disease. A placard, or titulus, was hung around each slave's neck, detailing their origin, age, skills, and any known defects. The seller was legally required to be honest about certain issues, such as a tendency to run away or a chronic illness, but deception was rampant. The potential slave was made to walk, run, jump, their teeth were inspected, their muscles prodded. It was a terrifying, humiliating ordeal, stripped of all dignity, where one's value was reduced to a purely economic calculation. The slave dealer, the mango, would shout out their qualities, praising a woman's fertility, a man's strength, or a child's docile nature. Families captured together were routinely torn apart at these markets, sold to different masters, never to see one another again. The sounds of these places must have been a cacophony of human misery, the slick patter of the dealers, the cold, calculating questions of buyers, and the weeping of those who were watching their last connections to their old lives being irrevocably shattered. To be sold was to have your identity erased and replaced by a price tag. The legal void, residential and dominica potestas. Legally, the Roman slave was not a person. They were res, a thing, a piece of property, no different in the eyes of the law from a chair, a chariot, or a farm animal. The master, or dominus, held absolute power over his property. This power, known as dominica potestas, was near total. It included the right to command any labor, no matter how arduous or dangerous. The right to inflict punishment, from whipping to torture, for any perceived infraction. The absolute right to control the slave's life and death. A master could kill his slave with legal impunity for much of Roman history. While later imperial laws, influenced by Stoic philosophy, began to introduce some minimal protections, making it illegal to kill a slave without cause or to sell them into prostitution against their will, these laws were often weak, poorly enforced, and did little to alter the fundamental reality of the master's power. A slave could not own property in their own right. Anything they acquired, whether through savings or as a gift, legally belonged to their master. They could be given a peculium, a small fund or property to manage, which offered a sliver of economic autonomy and an incentive to work hard, but it was always legally the master's possession and could be revoked at any time. Slaves could not legally marry. Their unions, known as contubernium, or tent sharing, were not recognized by the state and could be dissolved at the master's whim. Their children were not their own but belonged to the master. The slave's body was also entirely at the master's disposal for sexual use. There was no concept of rape when it came to a slave, as they were property. Male and female slaves, young and old, were vulnerable to the sexual demands of their master's family, and even guests. This constant threat of sexual violence was a powerful tool of domination and a source of profound psychological trauma. The slave lived in a legal void, an instrument with a voice, instrumentum vocale, as the writer Varro chillingly classified them, somewhere between livestock, instrumentum semivocale, and farm tools, instrumentum mutum. This legal status was the bedrock of their suffering, stripping them of personhood and leaving them utterly exposed to the whims, cruelty, or rare kindness of the person who owned them. A spectrum of servitude. To speak of a single slave experience in Rome is impossible. It was a vast spectrum of servitude, a hierarchy of suffering where the chasm between the highest and lowest positions was as wide as the empire itself. At the very bottom, in the deepest pits of this hierarchy, were the slaves condemned to the mines and quarries. This was often a death sentence. Working in brutal conditions deep underground in dark, cramped, and unsafe tunnels, they chipped away at rock to extract gold, silver, tin, and salt. The historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, gives a harrowing account of the Spanish silver mines, describing men working in shifts day and night, whipped by overseers, dying in tunnel collapses, their bodies never recovered. They were branded, chained, and worked until they dropped. Their life expectancy was measured in months, not years. This was where the empire sent its most troublesome captives and its most recalcitrant slaves. It was an anonymous, brutal, and short existence, a true vision of hell on earth. Closely related in misery were the agricultural slaves who toiled on the vast estates, the latifundia, that covered much of Italy and the provinces. These estates were run like factories, designed for maximum profit. Slaves worked in chain gangs, or agastula, under the watchful eye of an overseer, Villicus, who was often a slave himself. From sunrise to sunset, they plowed fields, tended vines and olive groves, and harvested crops. Their food was meager, their shelter often little more than a crowded, windowless barracks where they were locked in at night. The work was backbreaking and monotonous. Cato the Elder, in his treatise on agriculture, gives cold, calculating advice on how to manage farm slaves: work them hard, feed them just enough to keep them productive, and sell them off when they become old or sick. There was no room for sentiment, only brutal efficiency. These were the slaves who fueled Rome's agricultural economy, their sweat and suffering producing the grain, wine, and oil that fed the cities. Life could be slightly different for urban and public slaves. Servi publici, or public slaves, were owned not by individuals but by the Roman state or municipalities. They performed a variety of essential civic jobs, working as maintenance crews for roads, temples, and aqueducts, as attendants in public baths, or as clerks in government administrative offices. While still unfree, their position offered a degree of stability and anonymity that was absent on the latifundia, though their overseers could still be incredibly harsh. The largest and most diverse group was the domestic slave population, the familia urbana, who lived and worked within the households of wealthy Romans. A rich senator's home could teem with dozens, even hundreds, of slaves, each with a specialized role. There were doormen, osterii, sometimes chained near the entrance as a display of security, litter-bearers, lecticarii, who carried their masters through the streets, cooks, coci, who prepared elaborate banquets, hairdressers, ornatrices, and valets, vestiplici. There were wet nurses, nutresses, for the infants and pedagogues, pedagogi, often educated Greeks, who escorted the children to school and supervised their studies. Proximity to the master's family was a double-edged sword. It could lead to better food, better clothing, and even a strange form of affection and intimacy, but it also meant constant scrutiny and the potential for intense personal cruelty, emotional abuse, and sexual exploitation from any member of the household. A spilled drink or a poorly arranged toga could result in a savage beating. Life was a precarious balancing act of obedience and invisibility. At the very top of the slave hierarchy were the highly educated and skilled slaves. These individuals were valuable investments and often wielded considerable influence despite their lack of freedom. Greek slaves, prized for their learning, served as tutors, doctors, philosophers, and librarians. Others acted as business managers, accountants, dispensators, and scribes, amanuenses, effectively running their master's commercial enterprises or literary affairs. A skilled slave craftsman could earn a significant income for his master. These slaves often lived in relative comfort, were well-dressed, and might even be entrusted with their own peculium. Yet their situation was a profound paradox. They could be intellectually superior to their owners, possessing knowledge and skills their masters relied upon, but they were still property. They could advise a senator on a speech, but could be sold on a whim. This unique position created a world of subtle power dynamics, where an enslaved intellectual had to navigate the treacherous waters of providing essential expertise while maintaining the deferential posture of a subordinate. Theirs was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. The daily life and the hope of freedom. The daily life of a Roman slave was a relentless cycle of labor, dictated by the sun and the needs of their master. For the vast majority, the day began before dawn and ended long after dusk. There were no weekends, no holidays, unless a master chose to grant them. The work was often physically demanding and monotonous. Food was a matter of basic sustenance, not pleasure. The typical slave ration, known as the contubernium, consisted primarily of coarse bread or grain porridge, supplemented with olives, figs, and cheap sour wine. Meat was a rare luxury. The quality and quantity were just enough to fuel another day's labor. Shelter was equally grim. While domestic slaves might sleep on pallets in the corridors or kitchens of the main house, agricultural and industrial slaves were often housed in crowded, unsanitary barracks, the Augustella, which were frequently little more than subterranean prisons. Clothing was minimal, usually a single rough tunic made of wool or linen, expected to last a year. Hygiene was poor, and disease was rampant in these crowded conditions. Life was a grim struggle for survival, a reality far removed from the pristine marble statues and grand literature we associate with Rome. It was a life lived on the very edge of human endurance. In the face of such overwhelming oppression, it is tempting to think of the enslaved population as passive victims, but this would be a profound disservice to their humanity. Resistance was a constant, if often subtle, feature of Roman slavery. It took many forms. Everyday resistance, working slowly, feigning illness or ignorance, breaking tools, damaging crops, or engaging in petty theft. These small acts of sabotage were a way to reclaim a tiny measure of autonomy and to push back against the master's demand for total productivity. Running away, a runaway slave, a fugitivus, was a source of great anxiety for owners. They represented both a financial loss and a challenge to the master's authority. A network of professional slave catchers, the fugitivari, existed to hunt them down. When caught, runaways faced severe punishment. They might be branded on the forehead with the letters FUG for fugitivus, forced to wear a metal collar, or in the most extreme cases, be crucified or thrown to the beasts in the arena as a terrifying example to others. Violence and revolt, the most extreme form of individual resistance, was violence against the master. The murder of a dominus was the ultimate transgression, and the Roman state responded with unparalleled severity. An ancient and brutal law dictated that if a master was killed by a slave, all slaves living under the same roof, the entire familia urbana, were to be put to death, regardless of their age, gender, or guilt. This was collective punishment on a horrifying scale, designed to ensure that slaves would police each other out of sheer self-preservation. This law was famously enforced in 61 AD, when the city prefect Lucius Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his slaves. Despite public protest, the Senate enforced the law and all 400 of his household slaves were executed. Then there were the great Servile Wars that shook the Roman Republic to its core. The most famous was the Third Servile War, led by the Thracian gladiator Spartacus from 73 to 71 BC. What began with a small group of about 70 gladiators swelled into a massive army of slaves, runaways, and poor freemen, at its height numbering perhaps 70,000 to 120,000 strong. The revolt was ultimately crushed, and the aftermath was a chilling display of Roman power. Crassus had 6,000 captured survivors crucified along the Appian Way as an unforgettable warning. Yet, amidst this landscape of utter despair, there existed a fragile glimmer of hope, the possibility of freedom. The process of freeing a slave was known as manumission. While the vast majority of slaves died in bondage, a significant number, particularly urban and domestic slaves, could realistically hope to be freed one day. Manumission could happen in several ways. A master might free a slave in his will as a posthumous act of generosity. A slave could, if allowed, manage a peculium over many years to purchase their own freedom, or a slave could be freed for exceptionally loyal service. The freed slave, now a libertus or liberta, would wear a special conical cap, the pileus, a symbol of their new status. However, freedom was not absolute. A freedman remained tied to their former master, who was now their patron. They owed their patron deference, respect, and certain services. It was a complex relationship of continued obligation. Despite the social stigma, many freedmen achieved remarkable success, becoming wealthy merchants and influential figures. Manumission acted as a crucial social safety valve. The hope of freedom, however slim, provided a powerful incentive for slaves to work hard and be obedient. It was a clever tool of control, offering a reward for cooperation within the brutal system. The Roman mindset. How could a society as sophisticated as Rome build itself upon such a system of institutionalized cruelty? It's crucial to recognize that for the Romans, slavery was not seen as a moral evil or a peculiar institution. It was considered a natural, inevitable, and essential part of the social and economic order. Their worldview, heavily influenced by Greek philosophers like Aristotle, held that some people were simply slaves by nature, destined to be ruled. Slavery was also seen as a consequence of fortune. Anyone, through the bad luck of war or circumstance, could fall into slavery. There was no racial basis for Roman slavery. Slaves were drawn from every corner of the empire: Gauls, Germans, Britons, Greeks, Syrians, Africans. It was a person's legal status, not their ethnicity, that defined them as a slave. Roman writers like Varro and Cato the Elder discuss slave management in purely economic terms, focusing on productivity and profit, not human welfare. Even philosophers who preached kindness and human dignity, like the Stoic Seneca, did not call for the abolition of slavery. Seneca argued that a master should treat his slaves with humanity, recognizing their shared human spirit, but he viewed this as a matter of enlightened self-interest and personal virtue, not as a challenge to the institution itself. The Romans simply could not conceive of their world without slavery. It was the engine that ran their farms, built their cities, managed their households, and powered their economy. To question slavery would have been to question the very structure of their civilization. And so, we are left with the colossal, silent legacy of these millions of lives. The Roman Empire, with its aqueducts, its roads, its literature, and its law, was a civilization built, stone by stone, on the backs of the enslaved. Their uncompensated labor created the wealth that funded the legions and built the forums. Their suffering was the invisible ink in the grand narrative of Roman glory. To live as a slave in ancient Rome was to inhabit a world of profound contradictions, to be intimately part of a household but legally a piece of furniture, to be entrusted with great responsibility but denied any personal rights, to live under constant threat of violence while being the essential foundation of society. It was to be a human being treated as a thing. As we stand in awe of the Colosseum, we must also remember the hands that built it. As we admire the philosophies of Seneca, we must remember the social structure he never sought to dismantle. Understanding this is not about judging the past by modern standards, but about seeing it completely, in all its brilliance and all its brutality. The story of Roman slavery is a story of power, exploitation, and unimaginable suffering, but it is also a story of resilience, resistance, the enduring human desire for freedom, and the quiet dignity of survival against all odds. We have come to the end of this somber journey, and I hope it has given you a new perspective on the Roman world, a perspective not of emperors and gods, but of the millions whose lives were a silent testament to survival. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is never just about the victors, it is also about the forgotten, the oppressed, and the unrecorded. Understanding this is not to diminish Rome's achievements, but to see the full, brutal reality of them. What part of this hidden history struck you the most? Did the sheer scale of the institution surprise you, or was it the complex reality of manumission and resistance? Share your thoughts below and continue this important conversation. If you believe in unflinching historical exploration like this, please hit that like button, share this video, and join our community by subscribing and ringing the notification bell. Your support allows us to keep telling these difficult but necessary stories. Thank you for listening.